7 years ago, you threw me away. Today, I decide your future.
Don't sign it yet. The voice echoed across the marble hallway, but the pen had already touched the paper. Elena Brooks looked up just in time to see the divorce documents disappear into Victor Langford's briefcase. Her hands instinctively covered the life growing inside her as he stared at her without warmth. Then he said the words that would haunt every person in that room. I would rather lose my marriage than lose my reputation. 7 years later, that single sentence would cost him far more than he could ever imagine. Victor turned away before Elena could answer. The attorneys gathered their files. His mother, Lorraine Langford, stood silently beside the window, avoiding Elena's eyes as though looking at her would somehow stain the family's polished image. The security guards waiting near the front door exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one spoke. Elena swallowed hard and forced herself to ask one question. So that's it? After everything we've built together? Victor didn't hesitate. What we built isn't the problem. The problem is what people see now. Investors talk. The media talks. Every gala, every interview, every meeting. They see you before they hear me. Elena stared at him, confused. They see my wife, she whispered. They see weakness. The words landed harder than any slap could have. Just 3 years earlier, Victor had stood in front of hundreds of guests promising to love her through every season of life. Now he couldn't even look at her for more than a few seconds. I carried your dreams when you had nothing, Elena said quietly. Now I'm carrying your child. Victor closed his briefcase. And that's exactly why this has to end. Without another word, he walked away. The sound of the mansion doors closing behind him felt like the end of an entire lifetime. If you think this is where Elena's story ends, stay with us. And consider subscribing because what happens next changes everything in a way no one inside that mansion could have imagined. 2 hours later, Elena stood outside the Langford estate with a single suitcase resting beside her feet. The rain had begun falling so heavily that even the expensive stone driveway disappeared beneath sheets of water. Inside the suitcase were a few clothes, family photographs, and one tiny pair of baby shoes she had secretly bought weeks earlier. One of the older housekeepers quietly approached before the gates shut. I've worked here for 26 years, she whispered. I've watched powerful men make terrible mistakes. This will be the biggest one. She slipped a folded envelope into Elena's hand. Don't open it unless you truly need hope. Before Elena could ask what she meant, the gates closed between them. She looked down at the envelope but tucked it into her coat instead. Right now, surviving tomorrow mattered more than mysteries. Across the city, Victor entered the annual Langford Foundation Gala alone. Questions started immediately. Mr. Langford, where's your wife? He smiled the polished smile investors loved. We've decided to go our separate ways. Someone laughed softly. Probably for the best. Victor forced a smile, pretending the words didn't bother him. Yet for reasons he couldn't explain, he suddenly remembered the tiny baby shoes Elena had shown him weeks earlier. He quickly buried the thought beneath another conversation. Meanwhile, Elena wandered through unfamiliar streets, searching for somewhere affordable to spend the night. Every hotel was too expensive. Every apartment required deposits she couldn't pay. The cold rain soaked through her coat. Her legs began trembling. A sharp pain spread across her stomach. No, she whispered. She leaned against a bus shelter, breathing carefully. You have to stay calm. We're going to be okay. She wasn't talking to herself. She was talking to the baby. A city bus splashed through a puddle, soaking her shoes. People hurried past carrying umbrellas. Nobody stopped. Nobody noticed. Then everything changed. The scream of tires shattered the evening. A black luxury SUV spun across the intersection, smashed through a traffic light, and slammed sideways into a concrete barrier with enough force to send shattered glass flying across the road. For one terrifying second, everything became silent. Then smoke poured from beneath the hood. Someone shouted, Call an ambulance. Another person lifted a phone. Someone else whispered, "It's going to explode." Nobody moved. Elena stared at the burning vehicle. Inside, a woman was trapped. She could barely make out a hand pressing weakly against the cracked driver's window. A young man grabbed Elena's arm. "Don't go over there. You're pregnant." She pulled free. "If that were me," she said, "I'd pray somebody ignored their fear." She ran. Every step sent pain through her body. The driver's door refused to open. She pulled harder. Nothing. She grabbed a metal emergency barrier lying nearby and slammed it against the window. Once, twice, 3 times. The glass finally shattered. Smoke filled her lungs. The unconscious driver's seatbelt had jammed. Elena's shaking fingers fought desperately with the buckle. "Hurry!" someone screamed. "The engine's on fire." She finally released the belt. Wrapping both arms around the injured woman, Elena dragged her across the wet pavement inch by inch. The stranger was heavier than she expected. Her own strength was fading. Her vision blurred. Then, a deafening blast erupted behind them. Flames shot into the night sky. The crowd screamed. The heat threw everyone backward. Elena shielded the unconscious woman with her own body. Sirens echoed in the distance. Within moments, firefighters and paramedics rushed onto the scene. One medic knelt beside Elena. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" She looked down. Blood stained the sleeve of her coat. "I'm fine." "You are not fine. My baby." "We're checking." Elena's breathing became uneven. For the first time since the crash, fear overwhelmed courage. As paramedics rushed both women toward separate ambulances, television cameras arrived. Reporters surrounded the burning wreckage. One police officer looked inside the damaged SUV and suddenly froze. His expression changed instantly. He spoke urgently into his radio. "We've identified the driver." The reporters immediately pushed forward. "Who is it?" The officer hesitated. Then he answered, "It's Margaret Whitmore." Gasps spread through the crowd. Even Elena recognized the name. Margaret Whitmore wasn't simply wealthy. She was one of the country's most respected billionaires, the founder of Whitmore Global Holdings, a business empire stretching across finance, hospitality, manufacturing, and technology. Newspapers called her the woman who could rebuild struggling companies with a single signature. Inside the ambulance, Elena heard the name but closed her eyes. It meant nothing to her. Saving a stranger had never been about who they were. Hours later, she woke inside a hospital room. A nurse smiled gently. "Your baby's heartbeat is strong." Relief flooded Elena's face. Tears rolled silently down her cheeks. "Thank you." The nurse hesitated before speaking again. "There's someone asking for you." "I don't know anyone here." "I think you'll want to meet her." Before Elena could respond, the hospital room door slowly opened. A sharply dressed woman in her 60s stepped inside, walking with quiet confidence despite the bandage wrapped around her arm. Her eyes locked onto Elena. She smiled. "So," the woman said softly, "you're the reason I'm still alive." Elena immediately recognized her. Margaret Whitmore. But before Elena could say a single word, Margaret reached into her handbag, removed an old photograph, and placed it gently on the hospital bed. The moment Elena looked at the picture, the color drained from her face. Elena's fingers trembled as she picked up the faded photograph. It showed a much younger Margaret Whitmore standing beside a small neighborhood bakery, flour dust covering both of them. Next to Margaret stood a smiling woman with kind eyes. Elena stopped breathing for a second. "That's," she whispered. "My mother," Margaret finished. "Or at least, that's who everyone believes she is." Elena looked up, confused. Margaret pulled a chair closer to the bed. 35 years ago, that little bakery burned to the ground. My mother never rebuilt it. She always said one sentence that stayed with me for the rest of my life. Margaret smiled faintly. "Money rebuilds buildings. Character rebuilds lives." She leaned forward. "When I watched the security footage from tonight, I realized you lived by those words without ever hearing them. Elena shook her head. I only did what anyone should have done. Margaret laughed softly. No. Hundreds of people watched. Only one person moved. Silence filled the room. Finally Elena asked, "Why are you showing me this?" Margaret folded the photograph carefully. Because people have spent my entire career trying to impress me with ambition. You impressed me with courage. Elena lowered her eyes. I don't need a reward. I know. Then why am I here? Margaret smiled again. Because I don't give rewards. She paused. I offer opportunities. The words hung in the air. I've already read about you, Margaret continued. Your marriage. Your husband's company. The divorce. Elena stiffened. I don't want anyone's pity. Good. Margaret's answer came instantly. I have no interest in pity. She reached into her bag and slid a simple business card onto the blanket. I run an executive apprenticeship inside Whitmore Global. No special treatment. No shortcuts. 12-hour days. Impossible standards. Elena looked at the card. I've never worked in business. I know. I don't have a degree in finance. I know. I don't even know why you're offering this to me. Margaret stood. Because skills can be taught. She looked directly into Elena's eyes. Integrity can't. Before leaving, she added one final sentence. If you accept, you start Monday. If you don't, I'll never bring it up again. The door closed. Elena stared at the card for nearly an hour. For the first time since Victor left her, someone wasn't offering sympathy. Someone believed she still had a future. 3 days later, she walked into Whitmore Global's headquarters wearing the only business outfit she could afford. The lobby alone felt larger than the mansion she'd once lived in. Employees hurried past with laptops and coffee, barely noticing her. A receptionist smiled politely. Executive apprenticeship? Elena nodded. 42nd floor. The elevator ride felt endless. When the doors opened, dozens of experienced executives filled an enormous conference room. Conversations stopped as Elena entered. Someone whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. That's the rescue girl. Another voice answered. I heard the chairwoman hired her personally. So she skipped the interview process? A third executive laughed. Looks like bravery is the new MBA. Elena heard every word. She kept walking. Margaret entered moments later. The room immediately fell silent. I've heard some interesting conversations, she began calmly. Several executives shifted uncomfortably. Margaret continued. Some of you think Miss Brooks is here because she saved my life. Nobody answered. You're wrong. She looked across the room. She's here because she proved something none of your resumes can. One manager frowned. And what's that? Margaret answered without hesitation. That she'll move toward a problem while everyone else runs away. Nobody laughed after that. Training began immediately. The pace was relentless. Finance in the morning. Operations in the afternoon. Negotiations until evening. Then reports that often stretched past midnight. Every mistake was corrected immediately. Every success was followed by an even harder challenge. Margaret never praised Elena publicly. She simply expected more. Months passed. Then little Lucas was born. Elena's days became almost impossible. She woke before sunrise, fed her son, dropped him at childcare, worked 12 hours, returned home exhausted, studied financial statements after putting Lucas to sleep. Some nights she fell asleep at the kitchen table with spreadsheets beneath her arms. One evening she quietly whispered to the sleeping baby, I don't know if I'm doing enough. She kissed his forehead. But I'll never let you believe we were abandoned because we weren't worth loving. Across the city, Victor's life looked perfect. Magazine covers, luxury events, award ceremonies. Yet something felt strangely empty. One evening Lorraine placed a newspaper on his desk. The front page featured Margaret Whitmore announcing a new leadership initiative. Standing quietly behind Margaret, Victor froze. It was Elena. He stared at the photograph. His assistant noticed. Do you know her? Victor quickly folded the newspaper. No. But the lie stayed with him long after everyone left. That night, he searched every article mentioning Whitmore Global. Elena's name appeared only once. Executive apprentice. Nothing more. Victor leaned back in his chair. So she's rebuilding. For reasons he couldn't explain, he felt relieved. Then annoyed that he felt relieved. Months turned into years. Inside Whitmore Global, Elena became known for solving problems nobody else wanted. One warehouse was losing millions because products kept arriving damaged. Executives suggested replacing suppliers. Elena asked one unusual question. Has anyone watched the loading docks at 3 in the morning? They hadn't. She drove there herself. Instead of reviewing spreadsheets, she watched workers. Within an hour, she noticed something everyone else had missed. The damage wasn't happening during transportation. It happened because one conveyor belt tilted only a few degrees whenever temperatures dropped below freezing. A tiny mechanical fault, costing millions every year. The repair took less than 20 minutes. The savings exceeded $12 million in the first year. Executives who once dismissed her now waited for her opinion before making decisions. Margaret finally smiled. I wondered how long it would take. Elena looked surprised. You knew I'd find it? Margaret shook her head. No. I knew you'd keep looking after everyone else stopped. That single moment changed everything. Several weeks later, Margaret invited Elena to dinner at her home. Elena expected another business discussion. Instead, Margaret served homemade bread and soup. No board members tonight, Margaret said. No investors. No speeches. They ate quietly. Then Margaret placed a small wooden box on the table. Inside was a tarnished brass key. My mother's bakery, Margaret explained. It's all that's left. Elena carefully held the key. I don't understand. Margaret smiled. My mother believed businesses should feed more than bank accounts. She pointed toward the key. I've watched you solve everyone else's problems. She leaned forward. It's time to build something that belongs to you. Elena looked stunned. I work for you. Not forever. I owe you everything. Margaret shook her head. You owe me nothing. She smiled warmly. I didn't save your life. You saved mine. Elena was speechless. Margaret continued. I'll mentor you. I'll advise you. But I won't invest a single dollar. Elena blinked. You won't. No. Why? Because one day, when people question your success, I want you to answer honestly. Margaret smiled. You built it yourself. Months later, Elena signed the lease on a tiny corner bakery that everyone else thought would fail. The first week, only 23 customers walked through the door. The second week, 17. By the end of the month, she wondered if she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. Bills piled higher. Savings disappeared. One rainy evening, she stood alone behind the counter, staring at nearly empty shelves. Lucas tugged gently on her sleeve. Mama! She smiled despite her fear. Yes. Are we losing? Before Elena could answer, the front door opened. An elderly woman stepped inside carrying something folded under her arm. She placed it gently on the counter. It was the same envelope the old housekeeper had slipped into Elena's hand the day she was thrown out of the Langford mansion. I believe, the woman said quietly, it's finally time for you to know why she wanted you to keep it. If you're wondering what was hidden inside that envelope and how it would completely change Elena's future, make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next turns the story upside down. Elena stared at the envelope sitting on the counter. The same envelope she had carried through every difficult night since the day Victor Langford abandoned her. For 7 years, she had wondered what was inside. She had almost opened it dozens of times. But something always stopped her. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was the feeling that opening it meant accepting that the life she once had was truly over. The elderly woman looked at her carefully. Your former housekeeper, Mrs. Evelyn Carter, asked me to find you when the time was right. Elena's eyes widened. Evelyn. The woman nodded. She knew you would rebuild. She said you were the kind of person who didn't need rescuing. You only needed one chance. Elena slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were clear. Elena, if you are reading this, then you survived the thing that tried to break you. Her hands shook. I worked for the Langford family for 26 years. I watched Victor inherit wealth, power, and influence. But I also watched him become afraid of losing the approval of people who never truly loved him. Elena continued reading. The night you were removed from the mansion, I wanted to tell you something. Before Victor married you, his grandfather created a private investment clause attached to Langford Corporation. Her heart stopped. The clause protected the company from leadership decisions made out of arrogance or personal interest. But it required something unusual. Elena looked up. The woman across from her remained silent. She continued, a person who had been personally harmed by the company's leadership, yet still demonstrated integrity, could trigger a board review. Elena lowered the letter. What does this mean? The woman answered softly. It means your story was never just about losing the Langford name. She paused. It was about whether the person who carried that name deserved to keep it. Elena stared at the letter. For years, Victor had believed she left with nothing. But the truth was, she had walked away with something far more dangerous than money. She had walked away with proof. Still, Elena folded the letter carefully. I don't want revenge. The woman smiled. That's exactly why you might be the only person capable of handling this. 5 years passed. Elena's small bakery became a national brand. Then a chain. Then a corporation. She never abandoned the principles that started it. Every location donated meals to struggling families. Every employee received opportunities for advancement. People didn't just buy her products. They believed in her story. Meanwhile, Victor Langford's empire was quietly collapsing. The warning signs had appeared years earlier. Executives had ignored declining customer trust. Investments had failed. Several major projects had lost millions. But Victor refused advice. He believed admitting weakness would make him look powerless. At a private board meeting, one director finally confronted him. Victor, the company needs a new strategy. Victor stared across the table. I built this company. The director nodded. And that's exactly why this conversation is difficult. Victor stood. Are you suggesting I can't lead? The room went silent. Nobody answered. But Victor understood. They were thinking it. Over the next year, Langford Corporation's stock dropped dramatically. Competitors moved closer. Investors became impatient. Then one morning, Victor received an invitation. Emergency shareholder meeting. The reason? A new ownership group had purchased enough shares to demand control. Victor assumed he knew who was behind it. A rival billionaire. A competitor seeking revenge. He entered the boardroom prepared for a fight. The room was filled with executives, lawyers, investors. Then the doors opened. Every conversation stopped. Elena Brooks walked inside. Not the woman carrying a suitcase. Not the woman standing outside the mansion gates. A woman wearing confidence like armor. Victor stared. No. Elena calmly approached the table. Good morning, Victor. He looked around the room. This is a joke. No. She placed a folder in front of him. It's a board meeting. Victor opened the folder. Inside were financial reports, leadership reviews, investor statements, years of documented decisions, his own failures, his own signatures, his own mistakes. You bought Langford Corporation? Elena looked at him. No. She paused. I rebuilt what people thought couldn't survive. The board chairman stood. Ms. Brooks represents the investment group holding controlling ownership. Victor looked around desperately. You're letting her do this? A director answered quietly. We're allowing the evidence to speak. For years Victor had controlled every room he entered. Today facts controlled the room. Elena presented calmly. No insults. No anger. No personal attacks. She explained declining revenue, poor acquisitions, damaged partnerships, leadership failures. Then came the final vote. Victor looked at Elena.